When I first laid eyes on the farmhouse that would eventually become my dream home, it was as though every weary mile of house hunting, every endless night spent scrolling through online listings, and every discouraging conversation with realtors had finally found their purpose, because here stood a property that seemed almost as if it had been waiting for me all along. Perched just far enough outside of town to feel secluded, yet close enough that I would not be isolated. And it carried with it the kind of rustic charm that spoke directly to the part of me that had always longed for open skies, quiet mornings, and a life not dictated by the rigid, artificial control of manicured subdivisions and their ever-watchful homeowners associations, which until then had seemed unavoidable in my search for a house. The farmhouse was old but sturdy, a wide porch wrapping around its weathered exterior, fields that rolled out like an emerald carpet on either side, and a line of maple trees that looked as though they had been planted over a century ago by someone who knew the land would one day shelter families who wanted nothing more than a place where they could breathe without restriction. And in that moment, I knew, deep in my chest, that this was where I belonged. And no amount of paperwork, nosy neighbors, or overbearing rules about mailbox colors and acceptable shades of beige siding would stop me from claiming this little piece of freedom. The irony, of course, was that this farmhouse stood precisely on the line of a neighborhood where one such HOA ruled with an iron fist, yet it was blessedly excluded from the jurisdiction thanks to the property's age and the way the original boundary maps had been drawn, which created a peculiar bubble of independence that had infuriated the homeowners association for years and would, though I did not realize it yet, become the very spark that lit a firestorm of hostility from a woman who styled herself as the queen of that HOA, someone whose obsession with order, control, and power extended well beyond the borders she technically had authority over. A woman who would soon enough set her sights on me as though I were her personal project, an intruder into her fiefdom, and an affront to the world she had constructed around herself. But in those first blissful days, all I knew was that I had finally found the freedom to create a life that looked the way I wanted it to look, with no one policing how many flower pots sat on my porch, how tall my grass was allowed to grow, or what kind of fencing was deemed aesthetically harmonious with community standards. So I moved forward without hesitation, signing the papers, arranging the loan, and walking across that creaky wooden porch as its rightful owner for the very first time, feeling a thrill that carried me through the exhaustion of unpacking boxes and cleaning dust from rooms that had not been properly used in years, because this house, even with its quirks, its drafty windows and its chipped paint, was perfection in a way no cookie-cutter home in a tightly packed subdivision could ever be. And I knew that in choosing it, I had chosen authenticity over artificiality, independence over suffocation, and peace over the endless wars waged by HOA boards who seemed to thrive on conflict. The land itself seemed to welcome me, every sunrise painting the fields in gold as though nature itself wanted to remind me that I had escaped the suburban trap and stepped into something better. And for the first few weeks, life was exactly as I had imagined it would be, with long mornings on the porch sipping coffee, afternoons spent exploring the barn and clearing out old tools left behind by the previous owners, and evenings filled with the peaceful sound of crickets instead of the constant hum of traffic or the barking of neighbors' dogs who never seemed to stop. I planted flowers in the beds by the porch, not worrying about whether the color scheme matched any kind of approved palette, and I built a small chicken coop at the back of the yard, taking pride in the knowledge that fresh eggs would soon be part of my daily routine. And though the work was hard and the repairs were many, I felt alive in a way I had not felt in years. And for a while it seemed as though nothing could touch the fragile bubble of happiness I had created around myself. But if there is one thing I would come to learn quickly, it is that happiness rarely goes unchallenged for long. And in my case, the challenge came not from nature, not from finances, not even from the struggles of maintaining an old property, but from the very human force of someone who had decided my presence in that farmhouse was an offense, someone who believed that even though my land lay outside of her HOA, it should still bend to her will, and she made her presence known sooner than I ever could have expected, though at first it came in subtle ways. The kind of small intrusions that could almost be dismissed as coincidence, if not for the sharp undercurrent of intent that seemed to hang in the air whenever I noticed them. It began with flyers tucked beneath my windshield wipers, advertising HOA meetings I was not supposed to attend, as though someone were trying to remind me that there was a governing body nearby whose authority I had supposedly overlooked. And when I tossed them aside, they began appearing in my mailbox, sometimes accompanied by thinly veiled notes about community standards and shared expectations, which made no sense at all given the fact that my deed and the county records both confirmed in unambiguous terms that my property was not subject to those rules, but it was the kind of tactic designed not to enforce but to intimidate, to unsettle, to make me question the security of the freedom I had carved out for myself. And though I refused to let it get under my skin, I would be lying if I said I did not feel a flicker of unease whenever I saw the papers stuffed where they did not belong. Eventually, the presence behind them stepped out of the shadows. A woman whose name I would come to know far too well, Karen. Though, of course, that was not her real name, but the label that best captured her essence, because she embodied every stereotype of the HOA zealot, the kind of person who believed their word carried more weight than any deed, law, or boundary, and who took offense at the very idea of anyone living outside their control, especially if that person had the audacity to be happy in their independence. She lived in the house directly across from the edge of my property, her backyard abutting the fence line where my chickens pecked and my flowers bloomed. And it was from that vantage point that she watched me with hawk-like intensity, as though waiting for the moment I would commit some unforgivable sin that could justify her crusade. And while at first I tried to brush off her glares, telling myself that not everyone could be friendly neighbors, it soon became clear that this was not simply a matter of coldness or disapproval, but of active hostility, because Karen was not content to live her own life within the rules she so cherished. She wanted to dictate mine as well, and she was determined to find a way, no matter how convoluted or outrageous, to pull me into her web of control. The true beginning of her campaign arrived one morning when I discovered a letter taped to my front door, written in the kind of formal language that seemed almost laughable in its self-importance, warning me that the chickens I had brought onto my property were illegal livestock within the community, and that failure to remove them could result in escalation. And though I laughed at first, marveling at the audacity, I soon realized this was not a joke, because the letter was signed not only with her name, but with the title of HOA President, as though she genuinely believed that the reach of her authority extended across property lines into land that had never once been bound by her rules. And though I knew full well that she had no legal ground to stand on, the sheer confidence with which she pressed her case made it clear that this was not going to end with a single letter or a few glares from across the fence, but was the opening salvo in a battle she had already decided to fight. A battle that would test not only my patience but my determination to hold on to the freedom I had claimed, because Karen had convinced herself that my farmhouse, my land, and my happiness were all somehow illegal, and she would not rest until she had either bent me to her will or broken me entirely. And as I stood on my porch that morning with the letter crumpled in my fist, staring out across the fields that had seemed so peaceful only days before, I realized that the dream farmhouse I had thought would bring nothing but serenity was about to become the center of a war I never asked for. A war that would pull me deeper into the world of HOA politics, petty power struggles, and neighborhood drama than I had ever imagined. And though I had no way of knowing it yet, this was only the first move in a game that Karen intended to play to the bitter end, a game where she had already decided the rules, and in her mind, the only possible outcome was my defeat. The morning after I discovered the letter taped to my front door, I woke with the uneasy awareness that my life had shifted, that the farmhouse I had once seen as my sanctuary was no longer just mine, but had been marked in the eyes of someone else as a battlefield. And though I tried to begin the day with normalcy, feeding the chickens, walking the perimeter of the yard, making a list of repairs I wanted to finish before the end of summer, I could feel the tension in the air like a storm pressing against the horizon, heavy and waiting, because I now knew that I was being watched with intent, every action recorded in the mental ledger of a woman who had already declared my very presence illegal. I had thought at first that her letter might be a one-time flare of hostility, the sort of power move meant to intimidate me into submission before fading into silence if I refused to acknowledge it. But I would soon learn that Karen thrived on escalation, and ignoring her did not diminish her resolve, but instead poured fuel onto the fire of her obsession. Because when no response came from me, she escalated in ways that were both petty and infuriating, slipping new notices into my mailbox despite the fact that it was a federal offense to tamper with mail, each one more aggressive than the last, citing violations of rules that could not possibly apply to me. Rules about lawn maintenance, acceptable paint colors, restrictions on unsanctioned livestock, and even regulations concerning outdoor furniture placement, which seemed absurd given that my rocking chairs sat squarely on a porch that belonged to me and me alone. I shredded the letters and carried on with my work, but the sense of violation lingered, because it was not just about paper or words. It was about the creeping feeling of being invaded, of having my independence challenged not by accident but by a deliberate campaign, and it began to affect the way I moved about my property, making me glance over my shoulder whenever I was outside, noticing how often Karen stood in her backyard with a phone in her hand as though photographing every detail, and catching the way her curtains would twitch whenever I walked past the side of my house that faced hers, all of which made me feel less like a homeowner and more like a trespasser in my own space. I could not understand, at least not yet, how someone could invest so much energy in a property that was not theirs. But I would come to see that for Karen, the HOA was not just a set of rules, but an identity, a source of power she wielded like a weapon. And anyone who refused to fall in line was not simply non-compliant, but an enemy to be crushed. And so while I continued my renovations, painting the trim, fixing the gutters, and slowly restoring the charm of the old farmhouse, she escalated her attacks in ways both overt and insidious, because soon the letters were not enough, and she began trying to use the HOA board as her personal army. I learned this when one afternoon a man I had never met before walked up my driveway, clipboard in hand, and introduced himself as a compliance officer for the community. Though he seemed sheepish the entire time, he explained that concerns had been raised about my property and that he had been sent to check whether I was, in fact, under HOA jurisdiction. I politely but firmly informed him that my property was excluded, even pulling out the paperwork I had wisely kept ready in a folder near the front door. And though he nodded and admitted that I was correct, I could tell from the look in his eyes that this was not the end of it, that Karen's influence was strong enough to compel the board to act even when they knew the law was not on their side, because he apologized, muttered something about misunderstandings, and left with the air of someone who had been pressured into a role he did not entirely support. The encounter left me shaken, not because I feared the HOA itself, but because it confirmed that Karen was not acting alone, that she had allies, and that her fixation with me was not some isolated quirk but part of a broader culture of control that the HOA thrived upon, where pushing boundaries and bullying outsiders was seen as not only acceptable but necessary. I resolved to stand my ground, yet as the weeks rolled on, the attacks grew more personal, more creative, and more relentless, with Karen filing noise complaints despite the fact that my evenings were quieter than the endless lawn mowers and leaf blowers that filled her side of the street, placing anonymous calls to animal control claiming that my chickens were a nuisance and neglected even though they were well fed and cared for, and even going so far as to have a tow truck show up one Saturday morning to attempt to haul away my pickup truck on the claim that it was unauthorized street parking, even though it was very clearly parked in my own driveway on my own land. And each time I fought back, producing the paperwork, the records, and the proof that I was within my rights, but each time the frustration grew, because I was being forced to defend myself against attacks that should never have been launched in the first place, attacks that drained my energy and darkened the joy I had once felt about owning my farmhouse. The worst part was how relentless she was in twisting reality, because even when her efforts failed, she reframed them in her mind as victories, strutting about her yard with the air of someone who believed she had warned me or taught me a lesson, And I realized that her end goal was not necessarily to win legally, but to wear me down emotionally, to make my life so miserable that I would either give up and move or finally bend to her rules just to stop the harassment. But what Karen did not realize was that I was not someone who folded easily, and though her campaign unsettled me, it also lit a fire of resistance inside me, a determination to push back harder than she expected. Because this was not just about a farmhouse anymore, but about the principle of freedom, about drawing a line against the creeping culture of control that sought to dictate every detail of people's lives. And I knew that if I allowed her to succeed even a little, she would never stop. Because people like her thrived on the weakness of others. And so I began to prepare myself for a battle I had never wanted but could no longer avoid. I documented every letter, every incident, every intrusion, keeping a meticulous record not out of paranoia but out of necessity. And I researched local ordinances, county property laws, and even case histories where HOAs had overstepped their bounds, arming myself with knowledge because knowledge was the one thing that could not be spun or twisted by her theatrics. And though the process was exhausting, it gave me strength, reminding me that while Karen had her board and her bluster, I had the truth and the law on my side. Still, the emotional toll was undeniable, because what had begun as the joy of starting a new chapter in my dream home had now become a constant struggle to defend it. And there were nights when I lay awake listening to the faint hum of her backyard pool filter, wondering how someone could hate so deeply a person they barely knew, how envy, control, or simple bitterness could drive a person to dedicate so much of their life to destroying the happiness of another. And I realized that Karen's obsession was not really about me, but about what I represented. Freedom from her reach, proof that her control was not absolute, and a reminder that there were still corners of the world where her rules did not apply, which for someone like her was intolerable. And so she turned me into her personal villain, her project, her obsession, because in her mind, my farmhouse was a mistake that needed correction, a loophole that needed closing, an illegality that needed punishment, and she would not rest until she had convinced herself that she had restored order. As the summer dragged on, the tension between us became the silent center of the neighborhood, with whispers spreading among other residents, some of whom supported me quietly, expressing sympathy in passing glances or small gestures, while others aligned themselves with Karen, nodding in agreement when she paraded her grievances at HOA meetings or cornered people in driveways to spin tales of my supposed rebellion. And though I rarely interacted with them directly, I could feel the invisible lines being drawn, factions forming around a conflict that should never have existed in the first place. And I began to understand that this was no longer just a private feud, but a spectacle that others fed upon. Because HOA drama had a way of pulling people in, of giving them a stage on which to act out their frustrations, fears, and need for belonging, and my farmhouse had become the stage for Karen's performance. A performance she intended to drag on for as long as it took to either drive me away or force me under her control. The weight of it pressed down on me daily, yet I refused to yield, clinging to the farmhouse as though it were a ship in a storm, reminding myself that I had chosen this place for its freedom and its independence, and that to give in now would be to betray the very reasons I had fought so hard to make it mine. But deep down, I could sense that this was only the beginning, that Karen had not yet revealed the full extent of what she was willing to do. And as I closed the curtains one evening and saw her silhouette standing rigid in her yard, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing toward my house with sharp, angry motions, I knew that she was plotting her next move and that, whatever it was, it would push this battle to a level I had not yet experienced. Because for Karen, escalation was not just inevitable, it was her strategy, and the storm I had felt pressing at the horizon was about to break in ways I could not yet imagine. If the first phase of Karen's campaign had been the barrage of letters and petty intimidation tactics, the second phase began with her realization that simple harassment would not be enough to break me. And so she turned her focus outward, widening her circle of influence in an attempt to weaponize authority against me. Because people like Karen thrived on the illusion of legitimacy, and in her mind, if she could not force me into submission with paper threats and stares from across the fence, then she would summon the power of local officials, government offices and county inspectors to do the job for her, which marked the point where the harassment crossed into something far darker. Something that could no longer be dismissed as neighborhood drama, but had to be confronted as a deliberate campaign of escalation. It started subtly with visits from people I had never called, representatives from county zoning who arrived one morning to check whether my property was in compliance with agricultural codes, citing an anonymous complaint that my chickens were being kept in unsafe conditions and that the coop might not meet building standards. And though I was initially rattled by their sudden appearance, my meticulous record-keeping paid off because I produced the receipts, the diagrams, and the codes themselves, showing that my co-op was not only safe but fully compliant, and the inspectors, though apologetic, admitted that they had to follow up on any complaint, no matter how baseless, before leaving with the air of people who had already realized they were being used as pawns in someone else's game. I wanted to believe that this would end things, that Karen would see her attempts collapsing under the weight of evidence and logic, but instead she doubled down, and within weeks, new officials arrived. Animal control, again citing complaints of mistreatment. A county water inspector alleging runoff issues from my garden. Even someone from the tax assessor's office, claiming that there were concerns about improvements I had made to the property without permits, all of which I handled with patience and preparation. But the constant stream of intrusions began to wear on me, because it was not just the disruption of my daily life. It was the knowledge that Karen was willing to use every resource at her disposal to make me miserable, and the realization that she saw my independence not only as an affront, but as a challenge to her control that could not go unanswered. I began to dread the sound of tires on gravel, the sight of unfamiliar cars pulling into my driveway, because I knew each visit meant another baseless complaint, another attempt to chip away at my resolve. And though I always prevailed, the victories felt hollow, because they came at the cost of my peace of mind, and I could not escape the growing feeling that I was being stalked, hunted in my own home by someone who believed that her personal vendetta outweighed my right to live quietly on land I legally owned. The community, too, began to take notice, because Karen made sure that every one of her attempts was publicized, spinning her narrative of me as a lawbreaker, an outsider, someone trying to live above the rules. And though many neighbors ignored her theatrics, there were always those who believed her, or at least enjoyed the spectacle, and so whispers spread, painting me as the difficult newcomer, the person who refused to cooperate. And I could feel the weight of judgment in the sideways glances of those who had once been neutral, now drawn into her orbit by her relentless storytelling. This was perhaps the most insidious part of her strategy, because it was not just about exhausting me with officials and paperwork. It was about eroding my social standing, isolating me in a community where she held the microphone. And though I reminded myself that I had not moved here to be liked but to be free, the sting of alienation was real, because humans are not meant to live under constant suspicion. And even the farmhouse, with all its beauty and serenity, could not fully shield me from the pressure of being painted as a villain in a story I had not chosen. Yet despite it all, I refused to bend, telling myself that Karen's escalation was a sign of desperation, proof that she was failing to find any real leverage against me, and I resolved to continue documenting everything, to prepare myself for whatever came next. Because I could feel it building, the sense that Karen was not finished, that she had only just begun to explore the arsenal of tactics at her disposal. My suspicion proved correct when one crisp autumn morning, I woke to find surveyor stakes hammered into the edge of my property line, bright orange flags marking a boundary that was not mine but hers, pushed deliberately across the line into my yard as though to claim my land as part of the HOA. And though the move was laughably illegal, it was also chilling, because it revealed just how far she was willing to go, not just to harass, but to physically redefine reality, to alter the map itself in a way that erased my independence and folded me under her control. And though I pulled the stakes out with shaking hands, the message was clear. Karen would not stop until she had either destroyed me or consumed me, and the farmhouse I had thought would be my dream had now become the center of a storm that threatened to pull me under with its constant fury. I consulted the county office that very day, showing them the stakes and the records proving the property lines, And though they assured me that my deed was ironclad and Karen had no right to encroach, I could not help but notice the weariness in their eyes, as though mine was not the first case of an HOA president overstepping her authority, and their advice, though well-meaning, carried the undertone of resignation. Document, prepare, and be ready for a fight. Because people like Karen rarely stopped until forced by something greater than themselves. It was a sobering realization, one that shifted my perspective entirely, because until then I had hoped that logic, patience, and documentation would be enough to protect me. But now I understood that Karen was not playing a rational game. She was playing a psychological war, one where facts and laws were obstacles to be ignored or bulldozed in pursuit of her obsession. And if I wanted to survive it, I would need to prepare not just legally, but emotionally, steeling myself for the long haul, because what lay ahead was not a skirmish, but a siege. The evidence of that came quickly, because not long after I removed the surveyor stakes, Karen staged what could only be described as a public performance, gathering several board members and a handful of sympathetic neighbors at the edge of my property, where she pointed to my house, my chickens, my garden, and declared to them all that I was in violation of community standards. Her voice carrying across the field with the conviction of someone who believed her words could manifest reality if spoken loudly enough. And though I remained inside, watching from behind the curtain, I knew this was her way of cementing the narrative, of rallying others to her cause, and the sight of neighbors nodding, taking notes, or snapping photos filled me with both anger and despair, because it meant she was succeeding in dragging them into her crusade, turning what should have been a private harassment campaign into a collective effort to shame and ostracize me. That night I sat on my porch long after the sun had set, listening to the wind through the trees and the restless sounds of my chickens settling in the coop, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, the enormity of fighting not just one woman but an entire culture of control. And yet in that darkness, I also felt a spark of defiance, a refusal to be erased, because I had chosen this farmhouse precisely to escape that suffocating world, and I would not surrender it without a fight. I began to think more strategically, to consider not only how to defend myself, but how to expose her overreach, to show the community that her campaign was not about order or standards, but about obsession and control. And though I did not yet know how I would do it, I resolved to find a way, because Karen might believe she could rewrite the boundaries of my property and my life. But I knew the truth, and the truth would be the one weapon she could not ultimately silence. As I finally rose to go inside, I caught sight of her across the yard, standing once again by her fence, phone glowing in her hand as she recorded me. And in that moment, I understood that this was not just about land, or chickens, or property lines. It was about power, about a woman who could not tolerate the existence of freedom outside her control, and about me, the unwilling target of her rage, who now had no choice but to meet her escalation with strength. Because the storm was not passing, it was only gathering, and the next wave was already on its way. By the time autumn turned cold and the first frost coated the fields of my farmhouse, I had already endured the endless parade of county officials, anonymous complaints and shameless attempts at property line manipulation. But what came next marked a new phase in Karen's obsession, one where the stakes grew higher and the tactics more aggressive. Because when intimidation, harassment, and public shaming failed to drive me away, she turned to what she believed was the ultimate weapon in her arsenal: the legal system. A tool she wielded not with accuracy but with bluster, hoping the sheer weight of official-looking papers and lawyerly threats would be enough to rattle me into submission. And the first taste of this new campaign arrived in the form of a thick envelope shoved into my mailbox one chilly morning, its return address bearing the name of a local law office. And though my hands trembled slightly as I tore it open, what I found inside was less terrifying than infuriating: a cease and desist letter drafted on behalf of the Homeowners Association, claiming that my keeping of livestock, my construction of an unauthorized outbuilding in the form of my chicken coop, and my refusal to pay HOA dues constituted clear violations of the community bylaws, and demanding that I comply immediately or face further legal action, a letter so riddled with falsehoods that it would have been laughable if not for the implicit threat behind it. For a moment, I did feel the intended pang of fear. That tightening in the chest that comes from being told in official terms that you are somehow in the wrong. But then I reminded myself that my property was not under HOA jurisdiction, that my chickens were fully legal, that my cop was up to code, and that there was no legal mechanism through which they could demand dues from me. And once the panic subsided, I felt a rising wave of anger at the audacity of the move. Because this was not an honest legal dispute, but a calculated attempt to weaponize paperwork, to scare me into compliance by burying me under the intimidating veneer of law. And so instead of backing down, I did what I had already prepared myself to do. I contacted my own attorney, a man recommended by a friend who had dealt with HOA issues in the past, and together we crafted a response that was not only firm, but devastating in its clarity, citing county records, state property laws, and precedent cases that left no room for ambiguity. A response that essentially told Karen and her board in no uncertain terms that their claims were baseless, their jurisdiction non-existent, and that any further harassment would expose them to liability. Mailing that response felt like planting a flag, a declaration that I was not only unwilling to be intimidated but fully prepared to fight back. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps this would end it, that once faced with the reality of legal consequences, Karen would retreat, but as I should have known by then, retreat was not in her vocabulary, and if anything, my refusal to bow only deepened her obsession, because soon after, more envelopes arrived, each one a new salvo in her attempt to entangle me in an endless web of legal posturing, with allegations ranging from zoning violations to environmental hazards, each one requiring time, attention, and response, each one an attempt to drain me financially and emotionally. And though my attorney assured me that none of these claims held water, the sheer volume of them was its own kind of assault, a war of attrition meant to bleed me slowly rather than strike me down all at once. What Karen underestimated, however, was my resolve, because while the letters piled up, I continued to document, to file, and to respond with precision, turning her own tactics into evidence of harassment. And I began to see cracks forming in her campaign, subtle signs that not everyone on the board shared her zeal, that some of her allies were growing weary of the constant legal costs and the embarrassment of being repeatedly shut down by county officials and lawyers. But Karen herself seemed blind to it, charging ahead with the single-mindedness of someone who believed that sheer persistence would eventually bend reality to her will. And in that blindness, she escalated even further, filing what she no doubt considered her masterstroke, a lawsuit in small claims court alleging unpaid HOA dues, fines for non-compliance, and damages for lowering community property values through my unauthorized activities. A lawsuit so absurd that even the clerk who processed it raised an eyebrow when my attorney filed our response. And when the hearing date finally arrived, I walked into the courtroom with a mixture of dread and determination, ready to face Karen directly in a setting where truth mattered more than bluster. The hearing itself was surreal because Karen carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to achieve total victory, striding into the courtroom with binders full of photos she had taken of my chickens, my porch furniture, my pickup truck, and even my garden, presenting them as though they were evidence of crimes. And when the judge asked her to produce the governing documents that showed my property fell under HOA jurisdiction, she faltered, fumbling through papers that did not exist, growing increasingly flustered as my attorney calmly presented the county maps, the deeds, and the bylaws themselves, which made clear that my farmhouse had never once been included in the HOA's boundaries. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive, dismissing her claims with prejudice and warning her that further frivolous filings could result in sanctions. And though I should have felt victorious, the look in Karen's eyes as we left the courtroom unsettled me, because it was not the look of someone defeated, but of someone enraged, someone who saw the loss not as a reason to stop, but as fuel for an even greater escalation. And I realized in that moment that logic and law were not the tools that governed her actions. Obsession was, and obsession does not dissolve in the face of defeat, but hardens, deepens, and grows more dangerous. The days that followed bore this out, because instead of retreating, Karen turned to new tactics. spreading rumors that I had connections in the courthouse that had allowed me to win unfairly, whispering that my chickens carried disease, telling anyone who would listen that I was destroying the community, and though her words held no legal weight, the constant drip of gossip created an atmosphere of suspicion that clung to me like smoke, making even the simplest trips to the grocery store uncomfortable as neighbors glanced at me with curiosity or disdain, wondering whether the stories were true. It was a different kind of attack, less direct but equally corrosive, and it forced me to recognize that Karen's war was not confined to paperwork and property lines, but extended into every social corner of the neighborhood, and that if I wanted to truly protect myself, I would need to consider not only the legal front but the social one as well, because in battles like this, perception was often as powerful as truth. Still, even as her lies spread, I held fast to the knowledge that the law was on my side, and I took comfort in small victories. The sight of my chickens thriving, the steady progress on restoring my farmhouse, the quiet moments of peace that still managed to slip through the cracks of chaos, and I reminded myself daily that Karen's obsession, no matter how consuming, did not define me or my life, even if it constantly intruded upon it. Yet even as I clung to that perspective, I could not shake the growing sense that this war was far from over, that Karen's defeat in the courtroom had not marked the end, but merely the beginning of a more desperate, more dangerous phase, because people who feel their power slipping rarely let go quietly. And as winter settled in, blanketing the fields in snow and muting the landscape into silence, I knew that beneath that quiet surface, Karen was already plotting her next move, one that would push this conflict to new heights, and that the farmhouse I had once believed would be my peaceful refuge was destined to remain a battleground until either she broke me or I found a way to break her hold over the community entirely. The bitter taste of Karen's courtroom defeat should have been the closing act of her relentless campaign, the moment where reality forced her to acknowledge boundaries that even her inflated sense of authority could not breach. But instead it became the catalyst for something darker. More unhinged because stripped of her illusions of legal dominance, she shifted from the world of paperwork and procedure into a campaign of personal sabotage. A quiet war fought in the shadows of the neighborhood, where the goal was not to win in court but to make my daily existence unbearable. And I first sensed the change not in a dramatic act, but in subtle anomalies. Small disruptions that seemed harmless until they multiplied into a pattern too sinister to ignore. Like the morning when I woke to find my trash bins tipped over and their contents scattered across the road. Or the evening when my gate, which I always latched, was mysteriously unfastened, allowing two of my chickens to wander dangerously close to the road. Or the time when I returned from town to discover deep gouges in the side of my pickup truck as though someone had deliberately dragged a sharp object along its length, and though each event could have been dismissed as bad luck or coincidence, taken together they painted a picture of deliberate interference. The kind of petty vandalism designed not to destroy outright, but to slowly grind down one's patience, to create a sense of vulnerability that no lock or fence could fully dispel. It was psychological warfare more than physical, and I knew instinctively that Karen was behind it, because it bore the hallmarks of her obsession: constant, intrusive, but careful enough to skirt the line of deniability, always leaving just enough doubt that I couldn't march to the sheriff's office with proof. And yet the timing was too perfect, the escalation too pointed to be anyone else. Of course, I began documenting everything, snapping photos, logging dates, and adding to the thick file I had already compiled in anticipation of future confrontations. But the act of documenting did little to ease the creeping unease that now hung over me. The knowledge that every creak outside at night, every strange sound in the distance, might not be harmless, but the latest move in Karen's endless campaign, and that knowledge began to seep into my life in ways I hadn't expected, making me hesitant to leave the house for long, more vigilant about locking doors and double-checking windows, more guarded in conversations with neighbors who might be listening for fodder to twist and carry back to her. Yet even as she waged this quiet war, Karen simultaneously escalated her public front, spreading rumors that my farmhouse was a source of noise, that my rooster crowed at all hours and disrupted the neighborhood's peace, that my compost pile smelled and attracted pests, that I had begun running a farm business illegally out of my home, and she carried these claims not just to other residents but to local officials, once again attempting to weaponize bureaucracy against me by summoning inspectors and code enforcers to my doorstep. Though each time they came, they found nothing out of order, nothing beyond the normal scope of rural living, and I could see in their faces a growing weariness at being dispatched repeatedly for baseless complaints. A weariness that slowly turned into sympathy for me as the obvious target of a vendetta. But sympathy did not stop the disruptions themselves, and each new visit reminded me that Karen's reach extended far beyond her property lines, pulling me constantly into battles I never asked to fight. The strangest part, however, was that her war began to fracture the community itself, creating lines of division that cut deeper than I could have imagined. Because not everyone shared her obsession, and some of the neighbors began to tire of the constant drama, whispering to me privately that they were fed up with her antics, that they admired how I had stood my ground while others doubled down on her side, buying into the narrative that I was some sort of invader who refused to respect the standards of the community, and thus the neighborhood slowly split into factions, with Karen at the head of one and me unwillingly at the head of the other. And though I had never sought to lead any kind of resistance, the mere act of refusing to bend to her will positioned me as a symbol, whether I wanted it or not. This fracture revealed itself most starkly during a community potluck, an event I had planned to attend quietly, but which devolved into a tense affair as whispers followed me from table to table, and I caught sight of Karen glaring at me across the room, whispering sharply into the ears of her allies while others glanced nervously in my direction. And though no confrontation erupted publicly that night, the tension was palpable, a thin veil over a powder keg that felt increasingly close to exploding. The following weeks only proved that the keg was indeed primed, because Karen's sabotage took a bolder turn, no longer confined to the small, deniable acts of vandalism, but spilling into overt territory that could not easily be dismissed as coincidence, like the morning I stepped outside to find a threatening note pinned to my front door with a kitchen knife. The words scrawled in block letters reading, "Get out before it gets worse," a message that left no doubt about the intent behind it. And though my stomach churned with fear as I stared at the crude display, I also felt a grim resolve harden within me. Because if Karen thought fear would drive me away, she had underestimated me yet again. I filed a report with the sheriff's department, turning over the note and the knife, though the deputy who arrived seemed more frustrated than alarmed, admitting that without direct evidence tying it to Karen, there was little they could do beyond keeping an eye out, and while I understood the limitations of the law, it was disheartening to realize how much space she had to operate unchecked, how many ways she could continue her harassment without facing tangible consequences. And yet even in that bleakness, I began to find small glimmers of support, like the neighbor who quietly brought over fresh eggs from her own hens as a show of solidarity, or the couple down the road who offered to watch my property when I was away, gestures that reminded me that Karen's influence, though loud, was not absolute, and that the fractures in the community could cut both ways, isolating her as much as they isolated me. But Karen herself did not seem to notice or care about the cracks forming beneath her, because her obsession had grown too consuming, and as winter deepened, she launched her boldest act yet, an attempt to sabotage my property directly, which I discovered one frigid morning when I went to feed my chickens and found the latch on their coop tampered with, left just open enough that a strong gust of wind or a curious raccoon might have slipped inside, endangering the flock. And though I arrived in time to prevent disaster, the realization that someone had crept onto my land, under the cover of night, to endanger animals that posed no threat to anyone, filled me with a cold rage unlike anything I had felt before. A rage that made me vow privately that I would no longer simply play defense, no longer merely respond, but begin to build a case so airtight, so undeniable, that eventually even Karen would find herself trapped by the very web she had tried to weave around me. Because as exhausting as the fight had become, I knew now that it was not just about me or my farmhouse, but about drawing a line against the kind of obsessive control that people like her sought to impose on others. And though it would take time, documentation, and an iron will, I resolved that I would not merely survive this storm but outlast it no matter how fierce the next wave turned out to be. By the time the first hints of spring thawed the heavy snows and the fields around my farmhouse began to stir with new life, Karen's obsession had passed beyond the realm of petty sabotage and whispered rumors into something far more dangerous. Because what had once been a war of attrition meant to grind me down had evolved into a reckless campaign that put not only my property, but the safety of the community at risk. And the first sign of this shift came on a windy March night when I awoke to the acrid stench of smoke and rushed outside to find a smoldering patch of blackened grass near my barn. The flames thankfully extinguished by the dampness of the thawing ground, but unmistakable in their origin. Someone had tried to start a fire dangerously close to my building, a fire that, if not for the season's wetness, could have spread across the dry wood of the barn and ignited the hay inside, a fire that might have destroyed everything I had worked to build. And though I could not prove with my own eyes who had struck the match, I knew in my bones that this was no accident, no careless camper or wandering spark, but the latest desperate escalation in Karen's campaign, an attempt to turn harassment into catastrophe. And though the sheriff's deputies responded with grim efficiency, taking photos and samples, their words betrayed the same frustration as before. Without direct evidence, their hands were tied, and while they promised to increase patrols, I knew that Karen had once again threaded her way through the gaps of accountability, acting in the spaces where suspicion thrived but proof faltered. And the realization settled heavy in me that I was dealing with someone whose obsession had grown so unhinged that she was willing to flirt with criminality, even disaster, to achieve her ends. Yet even as I grappled with the fear of what might come next, the incident rippled through the neighborhood in ways I hadn't expected. Because for the first time, Karen's actions began to backfire publicly, stirring whispers not about me but about her. As residents who once accepted her stories without question began to connect dots, began to wonder aloud whether her vendetta had gone too far. And some even approached me quietly, their voices hushed, to say that they believed she had crossed a line, that while they didn't want to be dragged into the feud openly, they no longer trusted her leadership of the HOA, and that shift in sentiment, though subtle, marked the beginning of a new fracture, not just between her faction and mine, but within her own ranks. A soft erosion of loyalty that she seemed either blind to or unwilling to acknowledge. Still, Karen pressed forward with the same ferocity, doubling down on her tactics even as her base of support thinned. And soon the vandalism that had once been confined to my property began to spill outward, striking those she deemed my allies, with one neighbor finding their mailbox smashed after publicly expressing sympathy toward me. Another discovering their garden trampled just days after they had spoken kindly of my farmhouse restoration, acts of retribution so blatant in their connection that it became impossible for anyone to deny the pattern. And the once whispered suspicions about Karen hardened into spoken accusations, creating open tension at HOA meetings where members began to question her judgment, her leadership, even her sanity, though Karen, true to form, met these challenges not with reflection but with fury, railing against imagined conspiracies, insisting that I was orchestrating a smear campaign against her, portraying herself as the victim of an elaborate plot. And in that desperation, her behavior grew more erratic, more reckless, until even those who had once been her staunchest allies began to distance themselves, their silence at meetings speaking louder than their words ever had. Meanwhile, I continued to document everything, filing reports, compiling evidence, and working with my attorney to prepare for the day when her recklessness would finally hand us the undeniable proof needed to hold her accountable. And that day came sooner than I expected. On an evening when motion sensors I had quietly installed along my property lit up, and the cameras I had mounted captured footage of a figure in dark clothing creeping near my barn, attempting once again to tamper with the latch of the chicken coop. And though the grainy footage did not show her face clearly, the stature, the walk, the very outline of the intruder screamed Karen. And when I turned that footage over to the sheriff, something shifted in their demeanor. A recognition that this was no longer just the word of a frustrated homeowner, but visual evidence of trespass, enough to warrant a formal warning, and so deputies paid Karen a visit. their patrol car conspicuously parked in her driveway as they delivered the message that further incidents would escalate into criminal charges, a scene that the entire neighborhood witnessed and whispered about. And though Karen emerged from that encounter with her jaw set and her eyes blazing, insisting loudly to anyone who would listen that she was being persecuted, the damage to her reputation was undeniable, the cracks in her armor widening into fissures that even she could not patch. Yet instead of retreating, she spiraled further, lashing out at everyone around her, turning HOA meetings into shouting matches, plastering accusatory flyers around the neighborhood, even attempting to organize a petition to have me removed from the area, a petition that gained little traction and only served to highlight her dwindling influence. And as she flailed, I could feel the balance of power shifting, the weight of community sentiment tipping slowly but steadily in my favor. And though I took no joy in watching someone unravel, I could not deny the sense of grim justice in seeing the very tactics she had used against me collapse back onto her. Still, even as she weakened, she remained dangerous. And I never forgot that desperation often breeds recklessness, a truth proven one stormy night when my power went out suddenly and, stepping outside with a flashlight, I discovered that the main breaker on the side of my house had been deliberately switched off. A simple act, but one that left me chilled by the realization that she was still willing to trespass, still willing to creep onto my property in the dark. And though the cameras caught only fleeting glimpses of movement that night, the pattern was undeniable, and so I doubled down on security, adding more lights, more locks, more vigilance, determined not to give her the satisfaction of breaking me, but also determined to gather every shred of evidence until the day came when her actions would no longer be a matter of rumor or suspicion, but of fact, undeniable and prosecutable. And as spring turned to summer, that day drew closer, because Karen, unable to contain her obsession, finally made the mistake of overreaching, launching an act so brazen, so reckless, that it shattered even the last remnants of her support, setting the stage for the final confrontation that would decide, once and for all, whether my dream farmhouse would remain a refuge or forever be haunted by her shadow. The final unraveling of Karen's obsession arrived not with the quiet persistence of her earlier sabotage, but with an explosion of reckless desperation, the kind of act that reveals not only the depth of someone's fixation, but the extent of their willingness to destroy everything around them in pursuit of control. And by the height of summer, when the fields around my farmhouse swayed golden under the sun and the air carried the heavy stillness of late July, it was clear that Karen's grip on the neighborhood had thinned to a fraying thread, her allies reduced to a handful of the most stubborn loyalists, her reputation tarnished by police visits, rumors of trespassing, and her increasingly erratic public rants. And yet instead of retreating into silence, she seemed to draw power from her own collapse, thrashing louder, striking harder, as though the noise itself might drown out the truth. And that noise crescendoed one sweltering evening when I returned from town to find the most brazen sabotage yet. My barn doors wrenched open, feed bags slashed and spilled across the dirt, tools scattered as though hurled in fury, and a crude message spray-painted in dripping black letters across the side of the barn. "Illegal farm. Get out." The words leaving no doubt about their author. Not just in content, but in the manic energy behind them, an act too violent, too public to be mistaken for anything but Karen's work. And though my stomach knotted at the sight, I also felt a grim certainty settle into me, because this was the moment I had been waiting for. The mistake so glaring that denial was no longer possible. The act so extreme that it transcended petty feud and stepped squarely into criminal territory. And with my cameras capturing every moment, from the shadowed figure dragging cans of spray paint to the familiar outline of her gait, I finally had the evidence that transformed years of harassment into an airtight case. When the deputies arrived, their flashlights sweeping across the vandalized barn, their radios crackling with quiet urgency, I could see the shift in their demeanor. The resignation of earlier visits replaced by determination, and when they asked me for the footage, I handed it over without hesitation, knowing this time it was not just documentation for a file but a hammer poised to fall. And fall it did, because within days Karen was formally charged with trespassing, vandalism, and harassment, her mugshot circulating quietly through local channels. a single image that struck the neighborhood like a thunderclap, silencing even her most ardent defenders, shattering the illusion of authority she had clung to for so long. The fallout was immediate and unrelenting, as residents who had once sat silently during her tirades now spoke openly against her, demanding her resignation from the HOA board, circulating petitions not to remove me but to remove her, and within weeks she was stripped of her title. Her influence reduced to nothing more than bitter mutterings from the porch of her increasingly neglected home. And though she fought the charges with the same stubborn defiance she had shown in every confrontation, the court system was less forgiving this time. Her patterns of harassment laid bare through years of reports, her denials undercut by the cold precision of video evidence, and when the verdict finally came, sentencing her to fines, restitution, and mandatory community service, it felt less like a victory for me personally and more like a restoration of balance, a declaration that obsession and cruelty had limits, that even the loudest bully could not scream down the truth forever. Yet even in victory, the scars of the battle remained, etched not only into the side of my barn where her message had once dripped, but into the fabric of the community itself, a neighborhood left divided, weary, and forever changed by the spectacle of her downfall. Because while some sought to heal, to rebuild trust, others clung stubbornly to bitterness, unwilling to admit how deeply they had been misled. And I found myself caught in the strange position of being both vindicated and isolated, admired by some, resented by others, but at last free of the constant shadow of Karen's harassment, free to wake in the morning without scanning my property for signs of intrusion, free to tend my chickens, mend my fences, and restore my farmhouse in peace. As the seasons turned again and the farmhouse settled into the rhythm I had always dreamed of, I reflected often on the journey that had brought me here, on how a simple desire for quiet rural living had ignited a war that exposed the fragility of community and the danger of unchecked obsession. And though the memory of Karen's screaming, her flyers, her sabotage, her lawsuits, still lingered like ghosts in the corners of my mind, they no longer defined me or my home, because in the end, her attempts to control had destroyed only herself. Her name now synonymous with the very chaos she had tried to accuse me of creating, her house no longer the headquarters of an imagined authority, but a cautionary tale whispered about at neighborhood gatherings. And so I carried on, planting gardens that bloomed each spring, filling the barn with the hum of tools and the laughter of visiting friends, letting the farmhouse grow once again into the refuge I had intended it to be. And though I would never forget the storm I had weathered, I found solace in knowing that storms, no matter how violent, always pass, leaving behind the steady, unshakable ground on which new life can grow.